Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome everybody to the LSA webinar, Phase 3 of Small Business Digital Marketing. What does it mean? What is it and what does it mean for marketing provider? It's sponsored by BuzzBoard today, and BuzzBoard is actually responsible for this idea, which I think is very provocative, and which we're going to go through about entering a new phase of digital marketing for small businesses and how the market is changing. And we're going to explore that with Neil Polachek and Lem Lloyd. But first, I'd like to tell you that this webinar is being recorded. You can watch it on demand next week on the LSA website or on our YouTube channel. Here are the speakers for today. Lem Lloyd, who's a veteran of many local startups and traditional media businesses, and is currently a clickable advisor. Neil Polachek, who is a longtime analyst in the space, now board advisor with BuzzBoard, the sponsor of today's webinar, and then me, of course, Greg Sterling with LSA. And what we're going to do first is take you through some context about small business digital marketing, its history, and where it is today. And then we want to have a discussion, and we want you to be a part of the discussion. We want you to submit questions. We want you to comment on what we're saying in real time, and we'll bring that into the conversation. So feel free to submit questions, comments, discussion topics, disagree with us. We want this to be very interactive. This discussion that we're having today is part of a process that we're going through that will result in a report that we'll be putting out in the next month or two. So Neil, maybe you want to just sort of introduce the concept of this 3 phases.
Sure. Thanks, Greg, and hi, Greg, and hi, Lem. You know, I've been sort of analyzing and studying and being in this space for a long time now, and it just seemed to me that we've now sort of moved into phase 3 of this transformation of small businesses. And Greg will take us through kind of what that looks like, but you know, things are changing now, I think, faster than they've ever changed in this space, in part because the business owners in this space essentially grew up in the internet age. You know, if you were born in 1985, you're 30 now, you're starting a business, you know, the internet and phones have been present throughout much of your lifetime, at least 2/3 of it. So that's why I went to Greg and said, let's sort of push the envelope here. Let's think about what the next 10 years or even 5 years are going to look like, and let's, you know, talk to people, engage with people around what that's going to look like and how things are going to change. What I think are going to be substantive changes, not just incremental changes. Right?
Yeah. And so this concept of phases, of 10-year, sort of decade-long phases, is really just a framework for us to talk about these developments. And we're still formulating what we think are going to be the key pieces of this next phase, and this is why we want your input in this webinar. So this is not to present a finished theory or polished report. It's really to engage in the discussion with you, people who are living digital marketing, many of whom are working with business owners, local business owners, and who know this stuff on the ground, to give us feedback and input. So, you know, crudely, the first phase of the internet maybe, and much of this is sort of Neil's thinking to start out with, you know, was the sort of the introductory period where the technology was just sort of nascent or embryonic. There was a period of sort of convincing local businesses that the internet was worthwhile, that it was meaningful. There were a lot of false starts, a lot of false promises. And, you know, if we say that period sort of ended in 2005, roughly, the next period was marked by sort of the establishment of the internet as an important digital marketing medium, search, paid search, social media, digital presence management, and data syndication to a broader ecosystem of consumer destinations online, certainly the phenomenon of reviews and reputation management and monitoring, and then, of course, at the, you know, for the last roughly 8 years of this period, the rise of the the modern smartphone, marked by the introduction of the iPhone. So what is phase 3? You know, and as Neil said, it might be just 5 years, but we're sort of saying that it really is. It begins more or less now in the last sort of 12 months and going forward. And there's a lot of development sort of happening behind the scenes and or under the surface that may be obscured by some of the common refrains, the familiar refrains about small businesses. Oh, the market is too confusing and complex, and you know, they struggle to figure it all out, and they don't have a lot of money, and so on and so forth. The sales channel challenges that we've talked about extensively in the past. Some of these topics are kind of persistent ones, but I think we agree that they may not really capture some profound shifts that are happening, and we're trying to get a sense or get our head around that. And then here's kind of a list of things that we think are key developments and potential variables that are going to define this next phase. And we're going to come back to this list when we start into the interactive discussion. Again, I want to encourage you to submit questions and comments. You know, if you disagree with this, great. If you want to point out something that we're not saying, that's great as well. So I'm going to take you through, and Lem and Neil, feel free to comment on this stuff. I'm going to take you through some small business data. Where are small businesses in 2015? And the data that I'm about to show are primarily from two sources. One is an LSA-sponsored survey that was done earlier this year among, I think, 2,000 small business owners on a national U.S.-only basis. And then the other piece of the other data source is from a small business boot camp that LSA sponsored earlier this year, which had a much smaller sample, about 100 attendees. But it's another interesting input into this discussion. Newer small businesses, as Neil suggested with his comments, are much more inclined to embrace digital marketing than more established businesses, although everybody's doing it. What we're finding is that more and more channels are being used by business owners, reflecting the increasing complexity of the market. BIA Kelsey have data like this. Burrell has data like this. What we found is that roughly 7.2 channels, media types, are being used. This includes traditional media as well by local business owners.
And Greg,
yep.
Go back to that slide for 1 second, because what I think is going on is there's a lot of experimentation. There's so many things coming at these merchants, these small businesses, so many ways that people are pitching them on acquiring customers and engaging with their existing base, that I think we're in a period of trial and error, and I think that's what this is suggesting. And I think a hypothesis is over the next 5 or 10 years, there are going to be solutions that are bundled in as a broader solution, and we're going to kind of see this number go down over time. That's a hypothesis that I'd love to hear some audience feedback on, because I don't think a merchant can keep up with this.
I would agree, and I think it's an interesting. We talked about this on our prep call, and Lem, you had some strong opinions about this point, that merchants are going to get more selective with where they source their customers and leads, just because it's too difficult to maintain so many channels and devote energy to them.
I also think it's, on that slide, it's how you define the channel. So, I mean, you're still going to be worried about reviews across lots of different sites, free sites, paid sites, that go to your reputation in a non-sourced lead, let's say, just somebody calling up. But that's not really where you're going to be spending your money,
right,
or allocating your time or your service time. You know what I'm saying? Your employee time. So I think, Neil, you're right. I think, and we'll talk about later, I think you'll find across lots of different verticals, folks becoming more, kind of allocating their precious time to certain marketplace providers because it's good for their business, and that's where they'll get most of their leads or their business. But they're still going to want to make sure their listing's okay. They're still going to want to, make sure they respond to a less than perfect review. but it'll require less and less time and certainly less money from them.
And I think that's going to be basic hygiene over time. You know, it's going to be like, you know, businesses will treat that stuff as, you know, buying power and water for their business, basic stuff.
But it still takes time. It still takes time and expertise to do that.
Yeah, I think it's going to go to the background, and there are going to be more fundamental things around customer acquisition and platforms for business process and how they buy these things that are really going to be the fundamental things that change going forward. But let's keep going because we'll run out of time if we do this on every slide.
Yes. Well, this is a conversation. So this is some of the data that we got from that small business boot camp. We asked them what were the top channels they were using. And what's interesting here is that social media was #1. This is pretty consistent with other data in the market. Email marketing, sort of tried and true, one of the long-standing methods, and then SEO. And then what's maybe more interesting is sort of content marketing showed up next, and then you know, handouts, flyers, newsletters, print, offline stuff, and paid search, and down the line. Mobile was not on here, but again, this is a very small sample. So then moving to LSA, larger survey sample data, small businesses, different survey, but similar question. This time, what's the most effective channel that you're using? And I've called out the top 5 on the lower right for those that maybe can't see the slide as well. Website, social media, print Yellow Pages, interestingly, email marketing, and paid search. So websites always shows up very highly in these surveys. People value their websites. They think their websites are quite effective. They want to invest more in their websites. What's also interesting to me here is that social media, while everybody is on Facebook and everybody is using social media to varying degrees, we see a lot of questions about ROI still being asked. You know, lack of transparency, lack of sense that they're getting value from the time invested. This is not social advertising per se; it's presence.
Hey, Greg, on the topic of the website, you know, we do a bunch of data crunching around how many of these websites for small businesses are either mobile or responsive in functionality. And what we see is that even in sophisticated markets like the Bay Area, that number is not very far north of 20% in most markets. Markets like Austin have a higher penetration of websites that are responsive and mobile, but there's a huge number of sites that aren't. And I don't think merchants have figured out yet, and I don't know why, that you know, they're not going to be very, their ability for the consumers to engage with them is going down as more and more people use their mobile devices to engage. So there's a big gap between, are those merchants really ready for what's going on by the consumer, and I think that's going to have to change over time. Given that they buy so much on their website or believe it's so effective.
Well, what's interesting here on this chart, which was done in the survey was done earlier this year, is that mobile is way down on the list. Now it's mobile advertising or marketing, which is different
from having a mobile website or responsive.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. It can be interpreted differently, but it just shows this is directionally, at least, that there's a low priority being placed on mobile in contrast to the consumer behavior that's out there. So we're getting some questions, I think, coming in.
And I'd be curious from the audience about what they think of the role of video in all this too, because you know, if you look at a lot of data out there that you know, for lots of places, video is the next thing to really transform things.
You know, apropos of that, there's a huge opportunity for local businesses on YouTube with how-to video, which I can talk about a little bit more later. Just an enormous amount of consumer search around how-to kinds of queries. How do I install this? How do I put together this? And you know, businesses that create content around those questions, the most commonly asked questions of their customer base, most commonly encountered scenarios, that's a great opportunity to create content and to capture a potential lead with video, and it doesn't have to be super high production values. So I've got some questions that I want to throw in here. We saw print Yellow Pages show up relatively high in this list. Somebody's asking about direct mail. Why are small businesses so enamored with direct mail with so many digital channels out there? Neil or Lem, what do you think about that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's something that they've been doing for a long time. They understand how to do it. I mean, we should never underestimate the mechanics of getting something done, right? The art is spec'd, the offers, it's all in a form that they have, done for them, or they know how to do it. Remember, there's a lot of co-op dollars, so depending on what kind of small business you are, if you're reselling a manufacturer or some kind of service that has, parts to it, a lot of that is co-opable, and direct mail has always been part of the co-op equation. So it's kind of a cycle that feeds itself, and there's low price points to it, right, Neil? So I mean,
and it's also, I think, it's a way that my message as Joe Tire retailer can stand out in some respects, because I'm not bundled against 30 other, car or tire retailers inside of a Yellow Pages, online Yellow Pages, or inside of Yelp. So it's a way for me to stand out differently than perhaps some of the online platforms.
Share a voice.
Yeah. Well, and I'm not.
Also trackable, right? I mean, it's one of the old forms of trackable media where somebody brings it in as the coupon.
And if people post them on their bulletin boards, they become awareness advertising too. They're a reminder, I could go to Cane's for tires here in San Rafael. So I do think there is still power to that, and it still shows up in my mailbox. It doesn't have to be delivered in the newspaper anymore. It's coming through the mailbox, and we all still go to our mailbox every day, or at least I do.
Much of what appears in my mailbox goes directly into recycling at this point, but including.
Don't pull out a nugget. Yeah.
I've got a comment / question here. We're looking at a slide that shows the most effective channels. This person is questioning the small business objective. What are they trying to accomplish? Is it brand awareness? Is it lead gen? Is it new product introduction? These are different types of media that have different use cases.
Yeah.
And we're treating them all as though they're doing the same thing. Do you want to make any comments, either of you, on that point, that comment?
I think it varies depending on the merchant, depending on the category. I think the reason this market is hard to figure out is because there are so many differences from merchant or provider to provider. And what is their objective? I mean, you asked a merchant what their marketing objective is. You might get 4 or 5 different answers from 4 or 5 folks in the same exact space, operating in the same exact market.
But Lem, let me ask you: doesn't it tend to be the case that small businesses aren't really focused on brand so much? I mean, we talk about small businesses, and there's a wide range of categories and companies that fall into that, but they tend to be more sort of direct response or lead generation based or customer acquisition based rather than awareness or brand driven. Do you feel that that's correct, or would you dispute that characterization?
Yeah, I think they obviously want. Remember, this is across hundreds and hundreds of categories, so we all know that. And that's, something we'll be talking about is more vertical markets that are growing and growing. But they're not dumb, right? They understand. I think there's a movement that with technology, they have the ability to better measure their time and use of their customers. So they're getting more choosy, right? I mean, across all these, you want a good customer that is not just going to kind of say, okay, fix my toilet and then argue over the price of the service call. They don't want that. They want somebody who realizes that there's value of what they're providing, and they can be a long-time customer, and they can do bigger things. And I think they're going to gravitate towards marketplaces that have a great customer base, that bring them the types of customers that they want to deal with. Otherwise, they don't want to deal with it, right? So I think, just a lead is not a lead. So I think we'll talk more about that, but I think that's an important point to make.
I agree that it's an important point, and let's sort of go on and get to that broader discussion. So in terms of challenges that these small businesses face, not enough time and not enough expertise are bigger challenges than not enough budget, which is interesting, or not enough essentially budget to hire people, to dedicated people in-house. This is back to the boot camp survey, smaller sample, but we asked them to characterize themselves in terms of their sophistication. How savvy are you about digital marketing? And Tiny Slice said they were very sophisticated, with most of them falling, 51% falling in the middle somewhere. They have some degree of experience and some basic knowledge. A pretty sizable chunk, almost 25%, said that they felt they were experienced, and then something slightly less than 20% were true beginners. So all over the map, and I think that reflects the larger marketplaces where you have a wide range of sophistication based on experience, and which is owing to the previous 20 years of these programs to some degree. Budget, this question always comes up: how much are they spending? The bulk of them are spending less than, or half of them are spending less than $10,000 a year, but there's a substantial group that are above that. This is a very interesting slide. This is the larger survey that we did. It's kind of maybe a little bit hard to navigate visually, but the idea is, where do you need help? And that is segmented by age of business. And it really falls into SEO, data syndication, getting their listings to the right directories and consumer destinations, and social media. Those are and then website stuff and e-commerce for the bigger, more established businesses, or more established businesses. So it's SEO, data syndication, and social media marketing are sort of the three areas where the needs seem to be clustered. Anybody want to quickly comment on that before we move on?
It's not surprising that SEO goes across all of those.
Yep.
That's not surprising, and that'll probably continue as long as that is the front door for a lot of people.
Well, it's interesting because that is one of your sort of plumbing or basic foundational issues. I mean, I think that's one of the cornerstones.
Yeah.
But to the person who asked what does most effective mean, that was left up to the business owners to interpret what they perceive to be most effective. Sometimes what is perceived to be most effective is not the actual source of leads or business. I mean, witness the prioritization of websites as the most effective marketing tool. I firmly believe that.
If you think about that last slide, Greg, if you go back one slide to SEO, and SEO now means probably something different as Google has changed their algorithm, right? So it's not going to be just enough to have your traditional site have nice SEO. It's got to have that mobile visibility that Google wants. So that's going to change things a lot again, right? And
well, this is an area that continues to change and evolve. So this is why people need help with it.
It's going to be on there in perpetuity. As the algorithm changes, that's going to keep going.
Right, so, exactly.
Self-fulfilling business.
The smaller survey, do you work with a marketing consultant? A small number of them said yes. Most of them said no. This was a largely DIY crowd, but I think this is directionally consistent with where the market is. A lot of business owners trying to do things themselves, meeting with mixed success. And here's that same survey. How satisfied are you with digital marketing? So this is a different question than effectiveness, but it's sort of similar. There's an overlap, but it's a distinct question. So small group, extremely satisfied.
Greg, it would be interesting, sorry to interrupt, that this is a broad slide. So I think if you asked, maybe it hasn't in the survey, but if you asked certain businesses if they were happy with certain vehicles, they might have a higher satisfaction. right? Are you happy with, buying Google clicks? Are you happy with being on a certain service?
Right.
I think because this slide is pretty damning, right? Not many people are really satisfied, right? And like 25% are somewhat satisfied or really satisfied. Most of it, 80%, is I don't know, or I'm really not happy. But I think if you were specific, you'd find a different looking slide.
Well, and that goes back to, Lem, the number of media that people are using. That's why I think it'll go down. They're starting to figure out what is working and what's not. Totally.
So there's a couple of comments in here. I'll just read them quickly. There's a question or comment about providers. How are people making vendor selection? We have that data from previous surveys, and I think it really multiple variables go into vendor selection. Price is a key variable. Business owners are very price sensitive, as you might expect, but they also look for companies that have specialized expertise in their areas. They also look for those that are recommended by peers. So there are a number of factors that go into vendor selection, but price is a critical one. Now, choosing the low price vendor often or sometimes may result in a bad experience that then causes churn and so on. Another comment, this is a kind of a technical question about content and SEO. Aren't content and SEO categories merging, which is driving SEO across multiple age of business categories? I think the answer is yes, content is very important to SEO, but it's not the only consideration. I'm not a technical SEO person, so I can't give you a lengthy answer on that. Okay, let's move on here. There are a couple more comments and questions that I'll get to. Sources of dissatisfaction. This is the bigger survey. Why are you unhappy? I've grouped these slides thematically together, but they're from the two different surveys. Poor ROI or program results, and poor service, right? This is a close second. Poor service levels from providers. And that factor alone, better service, could probably save a lot of accounts that right now churn out.
It's very high cost to doing that. Well, there's very high cost to provide that service in an environment where the price points are being pushed down every day because the buyer, the merchants, want a better price or want it cheaper, and they're competing things that are coming up every day. I mean, this is an ongoing challenge. How do you provide the service levels that are necessary to retain and deliver value in an environment where your costs are increasing potentially and your margins are being squeezed?
Yeah.
Very challenging.
Yeah, it is. I mean, this is an interesting slide because if we agree with the hypothesis that your costs over time, if you're part of a larger marketplace where there's a lot more social interaction from the people who are engaging in buying services from the small business, if we agree that they're going to get a lot more input and they're going to see a lot more participation from them directly, then this slide will reverse because they'll see actual interaction. I mean, think about up until recently, what you got from your provider if you were a small business, you'd get a spreadsheet emailed to you, right? Or maybe you'd get some kind of dashboard that you can log in. And as we all know, most folks, small businesses, would never log into it or open up the Excel spreadsheet. So therefore, they were unhappy. But I think in the age of where you're constantly interacting and getting emails through a marketplace that is servicing the vertical for that SMB, then they're going to see a lot more activity and they're going to be like, oh, wow, there's a lot happening here. Okay, I got this business from this guy through this one, so I'm happy. And it'll be less about the provider, proactively calling them or emailing them or, God forbid, stopping by physically, which used to be the way we did it, right? It'll be more from the actual customer, which is healthy. So this should dramatically change over time.
And Lem, I think to your point, in the old world, it was the phone ringing that was my proof of performance. And I, as a business owner, if my phone rang a lot, I figured whatever I was doing was working. Same thing. If you get emails or messages or there's engagement, from the buyer market, then you're going to say these things are starting to work. So I think we're now in a new era where it may not be the phone that rings, but there may be other means of signaling to the merchant that it's working.
So I have just a question, not a question, but a comment here that I'll read, and then I want to ask you guys a question. So somebody's saying here that our ROI is the key factor. Lack of ROI clarity makes business owners hold back. But if they saw positive ROI, I mean, if they got a better sense of things were working, whatever that means exactly in their context, they would open up their wallets more. There would be better retention. That seems to me to go without saying in a certain way. That's I mean, that's not a superficial point. It's a profound point. But when we'll talk about ROI, it needs ways to prove ROI in a little bit. I want a quick comment from you guys before we move on. What do you think about the idea of the mobile app, the B2B mobile app that communicates directly to the business owner's smartphone about performance? There's a number of companies that are developing that kind of a thing. Yelp has one. There are others that have one. Perry Evans' company Closely has a Perch app that is very small, smartphone centric, and business owners I think are much more engaged in their smartphones than they are, necessarily in their PC. So going to a portal and opening up a spreadsheet or a dashboard may be a less common activity than checking a smartphone or an app. Do you think that that's a way for some of the providers in this space to have more communication and communicate value more readily?
I think you're going to need both.
Or Neil.
I think the business owner who's out doing estimates might want it on their phone, and the person who's sitting in the office and managing it might need it through their desktop. I think that both are going to matter. Both are going to be important. I don't think it's one.
Okay. Okay. Well, sure. I mean, any touch point with the customers.
And that's kind of what Lem said.
Okay. So phase 3. Now back to these sort of topics. Oh wait, I have a couple more slides. Forgot about these. So phase 3, I think there's really two big developments, and you guys may disagree, and the audience may disagree, that are happening. I mean, mobile is a tectonic shift, and this is representative of that. Google recently said, as of earlier this year, more searches on mobile devices than on the PC in the U.S., Japan, and 8 other countries that they wouldn't name. But that's a major change, and a lot of the location-based queries and lookups are happening on mobile phones. So it's a pretty spectacular development that has a lot of implications for everybody in this space. Apropos of that, or consistent with that, near me searches, growing enormously, which is causing a lot of effort on the part of Google to adapt to this changing consumer behavior. Mobile devices now, as I said a second ago, more commonly used for local lookups than PC. This is LSA Drive Analytics data. And then the other thing, which I think is really interesting, and Lemmy, you've talked about this a number of times indirectly, and we're going to get into this, is this sort of rise of what's being called on-demand, the on-demand economy. And this is the subject, I believe, of the Kelsey event tomorrow in San Francisco. It's a big, big deal. And this slide is representative of a lot of the vertical marketplaces that are emerging in these different industry sectors. And what's different about these, maybe you guys can talk about this a little bit. What seems to me to be different, there have always been verticals, there've always been vertical directories and classified sites, but the functionality and the mobile centrism of some of these new players is really interesting. Booking, payments, Uber is sort of the always mentioned poster child for this segment. You guys want to weigh in on this?
Lem?
Yeah, well, I mean, I just like these. These are the kind of system slides, and so I like the graphical nature. And there's so much happening on these slides. But a few things. I mean, if you think about some of these companies, they're actually disintermediating, obviously, not media necessarily, but certain small businesses, right? Because they're creating their own marketplace. So I mean, if you look at Uber and the left, they're certainly, quote-unquote, disintermediating kind of traditional local transportation alternatives. But then they're also creating lifestyle kind of companies. The same thing with Airbnb, which you have under there with travel and hospitality. I think for me, it'll be interesting to see what happens in the coming years is how far do these large vertical marketplaces that are so well funded and you could argue really well run and exciting, how far do they go? So, obviously Airbnb is an example. Obviously they're into housing and they're into tourism and they're into travel, and they're supposed to be getting into dining and offering dining solutions wherever you travel or go. They're also probably going to do more transportation because you've got to get to and from places. They're providing cleaning services now. They're providing educational services. So here you have a rise of these large kind of mammoth, kind of all-encompassing marketplaces that are going to be dealing, that SMBs are going to be dealing directly with. And they're not going to be dealing based on leads, right, or ROI. They're going to say, okay, they gave me Greg Sterling to come over, stay with me. I cooked dinner for Greg Sterling. He came to my restaurant. He did this. He did that. It's real business. And if they ask for 5 or 6 or 7 or 10% of the transaction, great. So there's no need for this kind of back and forth ROI lead thing. But anyway, it's just interesting how big these marketplaces will get. And they're very different than the quote-unquote Facebook or Google large kind of, I wouldn't say marketplaces, but large sites that we've seen. So, Neil, as you and I were talking, it'll be interesting to see what happens with them.
Well, and if you think about the providers underneath this, there are Uber drivers who got out of being, clerks in a law firm. The guy I had one day, he was, moving papers from desk to desk in a law firm. He's way happier, he says. He's making way more money. His hours are his own. And he is, I don't know who he is, and I'll never really know who he is. He's an Uber driver, and I don't care that, I mean, it was interesting to talk to him, but he becomes kind of indifferent. And so, if you think about it in some of these home sectors, are these terrifically independent business owners going to want to give away their brand, in a sense, to these marketplaces? I think that's going to be really interesting to watch.
Yeah, so this was the part of the discussion where we were getting into the interaction with the audience, which is already going. I just like to throw in gladiator pictures into the slide decks wherever possible.
Are you not entertained? Gladiator.
It's been a long time since I've seen that movie. I thought that might have been a psychotic episode that you were just having there, Lem.
Lem. Put that on Lem, please.
Okay. So this is a revisitation of this question that I referenced earlier. And let's jump into this idea that you guys just brought up. Wholesale versus retail. The marketplace is the brand versus with the small business as the fulfillment partner, the provider of inventory, the fungible, in some cases, the fungible vendor or provider of the service, as in Uber is a great example there. The old model was, the IYP or the vertical directory or Yelp, where you looked at a bunch of listings and maybe there were reviews or other content that you would use to make a decision, and then you would contact these businesses yourself and make an offline transaction. And the new model is really all of that is baked into the experience, and more often than not, it's on an app, and you initiate the request and you complete the transaction through the app, very often with a stored credit card or some payment mechanism. And Len, you pointed out that this is a full complete transaction with none of the ROI challenges of the old leads model, where there's no closed loop. So why don't you guys expand on this point? And I've got some other questions and comments that I want to throw in here, but why don't you jump into this about the brand issue with wholesale versus retail, and what you think is going to happen?
So,
Neil, policy.
Go ahead, Neil.
Okay, so I think a lot of it will depend on the the sort of the vertical that we're talking about. And within that is, there are always going to be these really independent providers who want to have their own brand, and they have built a brand in a marketplace, and they have great word of mouth, and they're great providers, and they have great, there's a lot of background noise. There's great, local following of these folks. And I don't see them ever transitioning into being part of a brand unless of a broader brand. I think when you get into services that are have much more frequency, and obviously the taxi, the transportation thing, it's kind of, you don't differentiate much between getting from point A to point B. That's all you want to do. So a lot of these things will depend on the nature of those relationships between the provider and the buyer. Lem?
Yeah, it all comes down to verticals, as you said. But, it is interesting to see some sites that are cultivating, providers to fulfill their marketplace needs. So if you look at a company like Zarly, which is in the home services space, their whole thing is that they'll find, they have a bunch of craftsmen that they really want you to use, and they have a great relationship with those craftsmen. And so who knows, if you're a craftsman, small business, what percentage of your time will be open to everybody, or what percentage of your time will be allocated to a specific marketplace? Certainly, you're always going to take care of your existing customers and maybe some referrals. But then the real question is, how much are you open to the public, in a sense, at large? Or whether you're saving the best for certain ones. I mean, it's interesting, in the auto services, if you look at that slide we looked at a little bit before, you see Your Mechanic, which is, backed by Andreessen Horowitz and a few other ones, a small company, and their whole thing is that don't go and use a local auto shop or the dealer, but we actually have dealer mechanics who on the side
will come to you.
For us. Right, and we'll come to you and do the whole thing. So, and those mechanics pledge, a certain amount of their time, their schedule to Your Mechanic, because they have to fulfill all the requests that are coming through the marketplace. So it's really interesting.
I talked to a guy who went to a place called Open Bay, which I hadn't heard, which is an auto repair model. And what they do is they essentially fill in for slots of mechanics who know they have an open bay tomorrow. They don't have a car, planned. So they're basically providing some inventory that they haven't filled and putting it into a marketplace. So I think, that guy's not going to walk away from his proprietary brand, but he may use a place like Open Bay to fill in additional slots that he himself couldn't fill. So it's kind of a hybrid model in his case.
So I want to pick up two themes flowing out of that. One is, what is the transactional nature of these marketplaces? So whether it's, there's a bunch of different examples that were just given, but all of them have in common the idea that there's a transaction at the heart of the experience for the consumer and for the merchant. It's not a lead, it's not speculative, it's a booking. And to the point that you made at the outset, I think both of you made, the idea of using so many different lead sources is gonna winnow down. Do you think that these two things are gonna come together, relying on fewer sources of leads or business, and then a much greater emphasis on transactions? So I'm just going to be less interested as a business owner in buying clicks or impressions or something much more speculative. How do you think that's going to play out?
So interestingly, to build on that Open Bay experience, the guy paid Open Bay, the guy who used Open Bay, and Open Bay paid the mechanic. So in that model, Open Bay was taking a piece of the transaction, and the mechanic was okay with his remaining piece of that. He didn't have to market that. He didn't have to spend dollars on it, and it was a transaction he was going to get. Lem?
Yeah. Yeah, no, and to continue in this auto repair theme, the transaction will be good for everybody. I think the small businesses, obviously, should come as no surprise, want to just do it a percentage of what they get in the door. For the provider, whether it's a media site or something like that, that should be good for those folks as well, because they should be able to make more money off of it. I mean, one example, which I think is kind of, it's an old example, but you look at local real estate, the real estate agents. They don't get paid based on how many people that they bring to an open house, or how many leads, or how many, people who make a bid. They get paid on the final transaction.
When it's done. Yep.
When it's done. And it's obviously, as we all know, much more lucrative for them to get 3 or 2% rather than per lead. The other thing is, with these auto repair places like You're a Mechanic, realize they're also sourcing the parts. So here's another piece of the equation, I think, for small business owners or for folks that are in this equation is that, what I pay the mechanic, I don't have to take a big percentage of that, the provider of the service. I can actually make more money by providing the part directly to the consumer through the marketplace, which is what they do. Now you get into this whole supply chain, traditional supply chain of manufacturers who would rely on their suppliers or their people who would service installers. And now they can go directly. So there's a chance for people to make money directly on the part. And if you've looked at, just the auto parts industry recently, the valuation for places like AutoZone and O'Reilly and all those things, it's just astronomical because there's such a markup on parts. And pretty soon it won't just be in auto, you'll find it in lots of other verticals as well.
So I want to sort of ask you guys about the impact on these more traditional, quote, marketplaces. eBay, Facebook, Google, Amazon, Yelp, some of the larger Yellow Pages publishers. These are largely lead generation or traditional markets where there isn't a closed loop, there isn't a transaction, although over time that's going to change probably. But what do you think is their role versus some of these more transaction-based verticals?
I think they're going to be forced to get into the transaction model over time. I think go ahead.
No, I was going to say Yelp is doing that with E24 and online booking and other things like that. They're already moving in that direction, and so is Google with the buy button. Although that's in an AdWords context, certainly Amazon is in position for that.
I think we're seeing a pretty significant shift, and it will become more significant into the models we were just talking about around transactions. And getting a piece of a 10% piece of something, rather than killing myself to go get leads and then say, oh, here's your ROI on those leads, which is a very uncomfortable conversation for both sides of the party. The person saying, here's your ROI, and the recipient saying, well, those didn't convert. That's a difficult conversation, and so I think the marketplace and the technology that's out there to close the loop is going to drive a lot of this stuff towards these transaction models, be it coming from a horizontal place like you have here or vertical players. And, frankly, Yellow Pages and Yelp, they're really vertical players. They just happen to have more than one vertical within their tent.
Right. Of course, we all know they're very different. I mean, the Yellow Pages, you could argue, like Key to some extent, has organic content and usage. But most Yellow Page companies don't really haven't created a community online like Yelp, which I think, this draws into the whole, question of, maybe 4 or 5 years ago we were going to be talking about resellers, the Reach Locals and the Yodels, all great companies. But if they were primarily reselling clicks that were lead-based, right, a lead, then where do they go? How do they transition? And of
in
course,
a transaction world.
Right. And of course we saw Reach Local, Zork, trying to create Club Local and then taking that, but there's a huge amount of pressure on them.
Well, let's talk about that because that's in here. But what's the role of the local media sales channel in this more transaction-focused world that we're describing? What do they do? What do they sell?
It's going.
Well,
go ahead, Len.
Well, I think that there's always been when you looked at the job description for any local sales, even if it was in the old days of print or broadcast, there was a certain amount of there's obviously account management built into there. So I think that if you look at large companies like Airbnb and you see the tremendous amount of customer service or account management that they need to provide, facilitating the transaction, there's still a role for people to help facilitate it all. But I think the days of kind of getting a bunch of sales folks and just kind of selling the lead is, it might just be a little bit of a different job, right? Different job description in terms of duties. They're going to have to cultivate the account to do different types of things rather than just getting them in the door and selling a bunch of leads. Neil,
well,
what do you think?
To your point, Lem, I think it's how do you add value to that experience, both in the selling, which may go away more, but in the servicing, you've got to add value, you've got to support, and I think it's seeing the sales process pretty intimately from the BuzzBoard side. It's very clear that when reps engage and use sort of the technology and put themselves out and learn about a business, they can actually engage differently than somebody coming in and just trying to, quick sale somebody. And that's the process of adding value to that experience. And if that doesn't happen, I think a lot of these channels will go away because there'll be models that add more value with technology than with people. And I think that's definitely on the horizon. I don't know if it's 5 years or 3 years, but I think the self-service model that Greg, you and I have talked about for 15 years maybe, I think is closer to being a reality today than it's ever been because of all the data that's out there that can be figured out and then turned into a buyer path instead of a seller path. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, and I think that goes to the question of like how all the sophisticated data and sort of machine learning and all the stuff that's going on in the middle can be used to make self-service a lot easier. One trivial example of that is Square's email marketing product, where they have purchase data from all the customers that the business owner has, and they automatically segment that into different, purchase histories and frequency and value, customer value, and then they can assign those to audience segments that then can be mapped to different email marketing campaigns, which are largely templated. So it makes it a lot easier for merchants to certainly segmentation is done for them, but then to customize or personalize campaigns based on their best customers or their lapsed customers, where Square is doing that data mining and telling them, here's the list of your
here's what you
customers
should do.
Yeah. Right. And so that kind of back-end sophistication, if you will, makes it easier to do self-service. Let me make a couple of comments here, and then we've only got about 7 or 8 minutes left to go. Somebody is asking about beacons and what role they'll play in closed-loop attribution in the future. And I'll just make a quick comment. You guys can chime in if you want. So Facebook is doing something with beacons where they're giving them away free to small business owners as a way to trigger place tips, which are offers, content, other things that show up in the Facebook app. If you have location enabled and you show up at a business address, so the bakery, welcome to such and such a bakery. Here's the, get our boysenberry scone today. That's all enabled by a beacon. It doesn't have to rely exclusively on beacons, but they're giving beacons away, and that enables all kinds of data and attribution stuff later down the road. Hey, you had so many visitors in your store this month, and then they can tie that back in some cases to promotions. This is an enormous development that if it gets adoption, and that's a big if, will really catch a lot of folks by surprise. Suddenly Facebook will be able to report on offline visits and behaviors, and folks that don't have that capacity to show that kind of data. Google's working on it, and other companies are working on it too. Will be really at a competitive disadvantage. Anybody want to say anything about that offline attribution or beacons in particular?
Well, you know about the beacon business at the mass merchant level, and I think that has so much data in there. There's a lot of value there. The use case you described about the blueberry scone, you know, I'm already in the bakery as the consumer. The tip is going to say buy a. I mean, that seems a little. I don't know.
The marketing side may not be as successful depending on the business, but the fact that they can say such and such a person showed up on such and such a date, and they can report that to the business owner, I think it's enormously valuable.
And if they had served up a something in Facebook prior to that, I think that's very interesting. But triggering to buy a blueberry muffin instead of a bran muffin, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, I mean,
but that's just one use case.
Right, it's another example of technology, you know, helping everyone get smarter, and you know, having the system go through pay to a transaction rather than just a lead. But I mean, I just kind of, you know, not everything in the local space, as we know, in the categories is around, hey, I'm right around the corner, let me zip over in and get a bagel. You know, I mean, you don't buy a heating and air conditioning system. You don't buy a new
on a whim.
On a whim. You don't go see a doctor just because they say they have an appointment, or you see a lawyer. So I mean, I do think that, you know, part of why I think our discussion, we always get enamored by the location aspect of things, which is really super important for lots of reasons, but it all depends on the category, the vertical. So, and I think if you look traditionally about the largest spending categories, then, you know, with the exception of a dining, then you don't really have that, right? So it's not that applicable. But it's certainly part of everybody getting smarter and leading more towards a transaction-based relationship rather than lead.
Well, and Greg, so you put in something. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, you put in something about payments, and I think it's frequency is a payments world. You know, you go to Pete's, frequency. Am I going to pay the roofer with my Apple Pay? No, doubt it.
Oh, don't be so sure. Don't be so sure.
Okay.
We'll talk in a couple of years.
Can I say one other thing? I saw a piece of data. Outside of the U.S., in the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, all these countries, 80% of small businesses use 4 to 5 productivity tools and cloud-based tools for their businesses, for their work. So I think where there's going to be a very big shift for SMBs is starting to really leverage the power that's been granted or provided to the large companies that's moving downstream to these merchants. And I think the merchants are now ready for all of these productivity tools that they weren't ready 10 years ago.
I would agree. So final comment, and then I'll let you guys say one or two things before we let everybody go. Here's a question about, does business frequency, or frequency of purchase rather, purchase frequency determine whether somebody uses a vertical or specific marketplace versus a general horizontal directory or site like a YP or Google? Any thoughts on that real quickly?
I mean, it's me. I don't know. Once again, it depends on the vertical, because if you're going to be doing something with a high cost, your frequency might not be great.
But your consideration is high.
Right. So, but you might do more with a vertical marketplace, but you also might do more with a vertical marketplace if you go to the place every day.
Yep.
If you use the you know, so I don't know if that's a contributing factor, kind of in that.
I'd agree.
Okay, so I'm going to make some closing remarks, and then you guys get to leave the audience with one insight or piece of advice or observation that you'd like to emphasize. So if there are any questions or you'd like to be connected with a speaker on the webinar today, just send us an email at webinars at thelsa.org, webinars at thelsa.org. We've also got upcoming webinars, thelsa.org www.lsa.org/webinars that you can check out, future ones. So I'll let you guys have the final word. Something you want to emphasize, leave the audience with. Yeah, go ahead, Les.
I think that when you look at that list again, that ecosystem, a lot of those companies are being helped by late round financing at huge valuations to create these super large marketplaces before going public. And so it's interesting to look at the funding side of that. And Neil, I know you've done a lot of work in that and have a lot of expertise, but because of that, I think they have the ability to stitch together experiences where they start in some vertical and then they kind of just take it from there. I mean, they go through the entire experience and stitch together a bunch of different kind of industries or experiences.
And figure out how they apply it to other verticals, yeah.
Exactly. And once you're already in and you trust that brand, that marketplace, as a consumer, you're in. And if you're in and you're a good customer, then SMBs, whatever vertical, they're going to follow. So to me, that's an interesting thing to watch over the next few years is how do these big marketplaces expand and become everything local across lots of verticals.
So vertical is the new horizontal. Go ahead, Neil.
Yeah, I would say that I think we've just scratched the surface on this phase 3, Greg. I think, I'd love the folks who have been listening or who listen down the road to engage with us and help frame up what we're going to write about in this paper. That's one thing. And secondly, I think that, there's so much, I think, I've covered this space for a long time, and I think we are really now at a point of real transformation because of a bunch of factors coming together: age of the business owner, age of the consumer market, all this technology, computers in our pocket. I think it's going to be really, really, really exciting and very scary for a lot of folks the next 5 and 10 years in this space.
Okay, on that note, thank you everyone for joining us. You can send us email, request the slides, look at a replay next week, and please provide us with your input, criticisms, feedback at webinars@lsa.org, or you can contact any of us individually here, and Lem is lem_Lloyd@yahoo.com. That's LEM_LLOYD@yahoo.com. Thanks again, everybody, and thank you, Lem and Neil. Very stimulating discussion. Talk to you guys later.
Thanks, Greg.
Thanks, guys. Bye.